Colleen was in the car, already dressed, already holding the gift bag with the tissue paper she'd spent 20 minutes arranging just right, when the text came through. "Hi Mom, I think it's just easier if you don't come today. Sheila has a lot planned and I don't want any tension. I'll explain later, I promise. Love you." She read it twice, sitting in her driveway with the engine still running, the air conditioning humming against a July afternoon that had already climbed past 90 degrees. There was no argument attached to it, no explanation beyond the vague reference to tension, and no acknowledgement of the fact that the shower was scheduled to start in 2 hours, which meant her daughter had known this decision was coming for at least that long, possibly longer, and had waited until the last possible moment to say anything. Colleen set her phone face down on the passenger seat and looked at the gift bag beside her, the one that didn't actually contain the real gift, because the real gift wasn't something you could wrap in tissue paper. The real gift was a crib, a glider, a changing table, and a dresser, all in a soft sage green her daughter had pinned to a shared board months earlier, all purchased in full 3 weeks ago from a boutique baby furniture store 40 minutes from Colleen's house, and all scheduled, per the confirmation email still sitting in her inbox, to be delivered that same afternoon to the address where the shower was being held. Sheila's address. Colleen had arranged the timing on purpose. She'd wanted the furniture to arrive during the party, wanted her daughter to walk outside and find it there. A surprise on top of a surprise. The kind of gesture Colleen had been quietly planning and saving for since the day her daughter had called to say she was pregnant, crying into the phone with a happiness that had made Colleen cry too, standing alone in her kitchen 400 miles away. Now she sat in her driveway, uninvited from the shower she had spent weeks preparing for, with a delivery truck somewhere on its way to a house she had just been told not to enter. She thought about calling the furniture company to cancel or reschedule. She had the number saved in her phone from the original order. Her thumb hovered over the contact for a long moment before she put the phone down again, because some tired, stubborn part of her had already decided that if her daughter's mother-in-law wanted her erased from this day, she wasn't going to be the one to erase the one part of it she had actually built with her own money and her own hands. She turned the decision over a few more times as she sat there, half expecting some wave of doubt to talk her out of it, the way doubt usually managed to talk her out of things when she let it sit too long. It didn't come. If anything, the longer she thought about it, the more certain she became that canceling the delivery would have felt like agreeing with the premise of the text message itself. Agreeing that she was someone who could be quietly subtracted from her daughter's life without consequence, without even the small, ordinary consequence of a truck showing up exactly when it had been scheduled to. She hadn't ordered that furniture to make a point. She'd ordered it out of love, months in advance, long before anyone had told her she wasn't welcome. Canceling it now would have turned an act of love into a form of punishment, and Colleen decided, sitting in her driveway with the engine still running, that she wasn't willing to let Sheila's decision reach backward in time and poison something that had nothing to do with her in the first place. Let the truck come, she thought. Let it come exactly on schedule. Colleen had raised her daughter Bryn alone from the time Bryn was 6 years old, after a divorce that had left Colleen with a mortgage she could barely cover on a school administrator's salary and a set of court-ordered child support payments that arrived late more often than not. She never talked much about those years, not because they were secret, but because they felt, in retrospect, like a long stretch of ordinary survival rather than anything worth dramatizing. She remembered specific stretches of it with a clarity that surprised her sometimes. The winter she'd worked a second job doing inventory at a craft store on weekends just to cover the cost of Bryn's braces. The summer the transmission went out on her car and she'd walked Bryn to day camp for 6 weeks rather than take on more debt. The countless nights she'd sat at the kitchen table after Bryn was asleep, doing the math on bills in a spiral notebook because it felt more manageable written down than it did floating loose in her head. None of that had felt like sacrifice at the time. It had just felt like what a person did when there was a child depending on her and no one else reliably showing up to share the weight. Bryn's father had remarried within 2 years of the divorce, started a new family in another state, and gradually reduced his presence to birthday cards and the occasional strained phone call, until eventually even those trailed off into something closer to silence. Colleen had never once badmouthed him to Bryn, had let her form her own understanding of who he was and wasn't, but she had also never pretended to herself that the job of raising Bryn had been anything other than hers alone. She worked, she budgeted, she showed up for every school play and parent-teacher conference and scraped-knee emergency, and Bryn grew up into someone thoughtful and capable, someone Colleen was, without exaggeration, proud of every single day. Bryn had been the first in the family to finish college, had built a stable career in occupational therapy, and had, in Colleen's private estimation, turned out about as well as a person could hope to turn out, given everything. Bryn had married 2 years earlier to a man named Dean, whose family occupied a very different financial world than the one Colleen and Bryn had built together. Dean's mother, Sheila, ran a successful interior design firm and lived in a house that had been featured twice in a regional lifestyle magazine, the kind of house with a name for its foyer and a separate room just for wrapping gifts. Colleen had liked Sheila well enough at first, had tried, in the early days of the engagement, to find common ground with a woman whose life looked almost nothing like her own. It hadn't taken long for the common ground to feel thin. Sheila had opinions about everything related to the wedding, delivered in a tone that framed them as helpful suggestions while somehow never actually inviting disagreement. She had opinions about the venue, the flowers, the guest list, and eventually, once Bryn became pregnant, about the baby shower, which Sheila had offered to host at her own home almost before Bryn had finished announcing the pregnancy to the rest of the family. Colleen hadn't minded the offer itself. Hosting a shower took real effort, and Sheila clearly had both the space and the resources to do it well. What had started to wear on her, over the months of planning that followed, was the slow and steady way she found herself being moved from the center of the process to its edges, one small decision at a time. The pattern, in truth, had started even earlier than the shower, during the wedding planning itself, though Colleen hadn't recognized it as a pattern yet at the time. She remembered one specific dress-fitting appointment, 6 months before the wedding, when she and Bryn had arranged to meet at a bridal shop to look at veils together, an outing Colleen had been looking forward to for weeks. Sheila had shown up unannounced, having heard about the appointment secondhand from Dean, and had spent the entire hour offering opinions on every veil Bryn tried on, opinions delivered with such confidence that the shop's own consultant had started addressing questions to Sheila rather than to Bryn or Colleen. Colleen remembered standing off to the side of the fitting room mirror that day, watching her daughter's reflection nod along to Sheila's suggestions, and feeling something small and unfamiliar settle into her chest, a sensation she hadn't yet learned to name but would come to recognize, over the following 2 years, as the particular ache of being present in a room and somehow still invisible in it. She hadn't said anything that day. It had seemed petty, at the time, to make an issue out of a shared appointment simply because someone else had also wanted to be there. It started with the guest list. Colleen had sent Bryn a short list of her own friends and cousins she hoped to include, women who had known Bryn since childhood and had been told, gently, that space was limited and the list had already been finalized by Sheila to keep numbers manageable. A few weeks later, Colleen noticed on the shared planning document, the one Bryn had accidentally left open on a video call, that the guest list included nearly 30 names, most of them unfamiliar, friends and clients and neighbors of Sheila's, with only a handful of names Colleen actually recognized. Then came the registry conversation. Colleen had asked early on whether she could contribute toward the nursery furniture as her gift, something substantial and lasting rather than the usual assortment of onesies and diaper bags. Bryn had loved the idea, had sent her a whole board of options, and then came the registry conversation. Colleen had asked early on whether she could contribute toward the nursery furniture as her gift, something substantial and lasting rather than the usual assortment of onesies and diaper bags. Bryn had loved the idea, and the two of them had spent a Sunday evening on a video call. Colleen propped up in bed with her laptop balanced on her knees, Bryn scrolling through furniture websites and holding her phone up to the camera every few minutes to ask what Colleen thought. They'd gone back and forth for nearly 2 hours, debating between a warm oak finish and something more modern in white, before landing together on the sage green set, a compromise between Bryn's more contemporary taste and Colleen's preference for something with a little warmth to it. Bryn had cried a little near the end of the call, the kind of happy, exhausted crying that pregnancy seemed to bring on more easily than usual, and told Colleen it was going to be the first thing anyone saw when they walked into the nursery. "I want people to know their grandmother helped build this room," Bryn had said, and Colleen had laughed and told her not to get sentimental over a crib, though she'd saved a screenshot of that exact moment in the call. Bryn's tear-streaked, laughing face lit up by her phone screen, and looked at it more than once in the weeks that followed. Colleen had picked out the full sage green set without telling anyone the price because the price wasn't the point. A week after she placed the order, at a family dinner at Dean's parents' house, Sheila had brought up the nursery unprompted, midway through the main course, mentioning that she'd already arranged for her own interior designer to consult on the layout. "She's wonderful, does all my client work," Sheila had said, cutting into her chicken without looking up. She thinks a soft gray would actually photograph better than green, especially with the natural light in that room. But we'll see. Colleen had glanced at Bryn across the table, waiting for some acknowledgement of the fact that green had already been decided, that furniture in that exact color was already on order, but Bryn had only nodded politely and changed the subject to something about the baby registry at a different store entirely, and Colleen had understood, in that small, unremarkable moment, that her daughter had chosen not to correct Sheila in front of the table, whether out of exhaustion or diplomacy or some instinct Colleen didn't fully have access to. The comment landed in the room with a strange weight anyway, as though the actual furniture arriving from Colleen's order was somehow a footnote to whatever vision Sheila had already begun building without her. Colleen said nothing at the dinner. She had learned, over the 2 years of Dean and Sheila's presence in her life, that saying something in the moment rarely accomplished what she wanted it to. Sheila had a way of receiving pushback that turned the pusher into the unreasonable party almost instantly, framing any objection as oversensitivity, any request for equal footing as an attempt to make things difficult. The pattern repeated itself in smaller ways over the following weeks. Colleen would suggest a date for a joint visit to look at strollers, and somehow the visit would already have happened without her by the time she followed up. She would ask about the shower theme and receive a vague answer, only to see, weeks later, custom invitations already printed and distributed among a group chat she wasn't part of. Each individual incident was small enough to dismiss on its own. Together they formed something Colleen had started to recognize, but hadn't yet found the right moment to name out loud, to her daughter or to anyone else. 2 weeks before the shower, Colleen finally said something, carefully, on a phone call with Bryn while Bryn was folding laundry in the background, the domestic ordinariness of the sound somehow making the conversation feel both easier and harder at once. "I feel like I'm being pushed out of my own daughter's baby shower," Colleen said. "I don't want to make this about me, but I've noticed it happening for months now." Bryn was quiet for a moment. "Sheila just wants everything to be perfect. She's not trying to push you out." "Maybe not on purpose," Colleen said, "but it's happening anyway." Bryn sighed, the kind of sigh that carried more exhaustion than agreement or disagreement, the sigh of someone caught between two people she loved and didn't know how to fully satisfy either of. "I'll talk to her, I promise. It'll be fine by the day of the shower." Colleen believed her, or wanted to, which amounted to nearly the same thing at the time. She let the conversation end there, told herself she had said what needed saying, and went back to finalizing the delivery date for the nursery furniture, still holding on to the image of Bryn walking outside during the party and finding it waiting there, a surprise that belonged to nobody but the two of them. The text arrived 2 hours before the shower was scheduled to begin, and Colleen sat in her driveway reading it 3 more times before she finally set the phone down and drove, not toward Sheila's house, but toward the small coffee shop 2 blocks from her own, because she needed somewhere to be that wasn't her empty house and wasn't a party she had just been asked not to attend. She ordered a coffee she didn't really want and sat by the window, checking her phone every few minutes out of a habit she couldn't quite break, though there was nothing new to check for. The coffee shop was mostly empty at that hour, just a couple of college students with laptops and an older man doing a crossword in the corner, and Colleen found herself watching the door every time it opened, half expecting, in some irrational corner of her mind, that Bryn might walk through it, having realized the mistake and come to find her. She thought about calling her sister, decided against it, not wanting to turn the afternoon into a group conversation before she'd even had a chance to sit with it herself. She thought about texting Bryn something sharp, something that would make clear exactly how the last hour had felt, and typed out 3 different versions of a message before deleting all of them, because none of them said quite what she wanted. And she had learned, over many years of difficult conversations, that messages sent in anger rarely aged well. Instead, she just sat there, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer, running through the last several months in her mind the way you might run your tongue over a sore tooth, checking to see if it still hurt in the same place. It did. It had hurt in roughly the same place since the guest list conversation, since the registry comment at that family dinner, since every small moment where she had felt the ground shift slightly beneath her without ever being given a clear enough reason to object. Around 1 o'clock, roughly the time the shower would have been in full swing, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she recognized as her cousin Denise, who had made the guest list cut and was, at that moment, apparently standing in Sheila's driveway. "There's a huge delivery truck here," says Nursery Furniture. "Is this yours?" Colleen typed back a single word, "Yes." She watched the little dots appear and disappear several times before Denise's next message came through. "It's a whole thing. The driver's asking for someone to sign and nobody knows what to do. Sheila looks like she's about to have a stroke." Colleen didn't respond right away. She sat with her coffee going cold in front of her, picturing the scene with a clarity she hadn't expected. The delivery men unloading boxes onto a driveway full of party guests in sundresses, a paperwork clipboard nobody quite knew how to handle, and somewhere in the middle of it, her daughter, 7 months pregnant, standing in front of a room full of people trying to understand what was happening and why. What actually happened, as Colleen pieced it together later from several different accounts, went roughly like this. The delivery truck arrived on schedule, exactly as arranged 3 weeks earlier, and the 2 drivers unloaded the crib, glider, changing table, and dresser onto Sheila's driveway, following the standard procedure of requesting a signature from whoever was listed as the point of contact on the order. The order listed Colleen's name and phone number, since Colleen was the one who had placed it and paid for it in full. When the driver asked who Colleen was, Bryn, standing nearby, went pale and quiet in a way several guests noticed immediately. Sheila, who had spent the better part of the party subtly steering conversation toward the custom mural she'd commissioned for the nursery and the rocking chair she'd personally selected from her own vendor, found herself standing next to a stack of furniture boxes she hadn't ordered, hadn't paid for, and hadn't been told was coming, in front of 30 guests who now understood, without anyone needing to explain it directly, that the mother of the bride had not actually been welcome at her own daughter's shower. Bryn signed the delivery paperwork herself, hands shaking slightly according to Denise's later account, and asked the drivers to set the furniture up in the garage rather than the nursery itself, since the nursery, as it turned out, had already been partially furnished with pieces Sheila had chosen without consulting anyone. The party continued, in the strained way parties do once something has visibly shifted in the room, guests making polite conversation about gifts and games, while a much more interesting conversation clearly wanted to happen and couldn't. Not yet, not in front of everyone. Denise called Colleen that evening, unprompted, to walk her through the parts of the afternoon Colleen hadn't been able to piece together from a handful of texts. She described the way conversation had gone quiet across the driveway the moment the delivery driver read Colleen's name off the paperwork, the way several of Sheila's friends had exchanged glances that made clear they understood exactly what they were witnessing even without anyone explaining it aloud. She described Sheila's attempt to smooth things over by suggesting, brightly, that the furniture must be a wonderful surprise, and the way that attempt had landed flat in a driveway full of people who had spent the better part of an hour listening to Sheila talk about her own contributions to the nursery. Half the room already knew something was off before the truck even showed up, Denise said. People noticed you weren't there. A couple of the older women asked me about it directly, wanted to know if you were sick or something. I didn't really know what to tell them. What did you tell them? I said I wasn't sure, Denise admitted, which felt like a lie even though it was technically true, since nobody had actually explained anything to me either. Colleen thanked her for calling, meant it, and sat with the added detail for a while after they hung up, turning over the image of 30 women standing in a driveway, slowly working out on their own what her own daughter hadn't managed to tell her directly until it had already become impossible to hide. Bryn called Colleen that evening, nearly 4 hours after the shower had ended, her voice thick with a mixture of exhaustion and something that sounded, to Colleen's ear, uncomfortably close to shame. Why didn't you tell me you were sending the furniture today? I told you weeks ago, Colleen said. I sent you the confirmation email when I placed the order. You said it was perfect timing. There was a long pause on the line. I forgot, Bryn admitted. There's been so much happening with Sheila and the planning, I lost track of it. I didn't lose track of it, Colleen said, and she heard her own voice come out steadier than she expected, given how much of the day she'd spent turning the situation over in her mind. I've been planning that delivery for 3 weeks. I wanted it to be a surprise for you. I didn't think it would end up being a surprise for everyone else too. Bryn was quiet again, long enough that Colleen wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier defensiveness. Sheila's furious. She thinks you did it on purpose to embarrass her. I didn't do anything, Colleen said. I ordered furniture for my grandchild's nursery 3 weeks before anyone told me I wasn't welcome at the party. The timing isn't a coincidence I created. It's a coincidence she created, by waiting until 2 hours before the shower to tell me not to come. I know, Bryn said, quietly. I know that. I didn't want things to be tense today, and I let her convince me it would be easier without you there. And I didn't think about what that actually meant until I was standing in the driveway signing for a crib with your name on it in front of 30 people. Did you know beforehand, Colleen asked, that she was going to send that text, or did she just decide it on her own? Bryn hesitated long enough that Colleen already knew the answer before it came. She brought it up yesterday, said it would be simpler, said you two hadn't really connected the way she'd hoped. Said it might make things awkward with her side of the family there. I told her I didn't think it was a good idea. I should have said more than that. I should have just told her no. Why didn't you? Because she was already so invested in the whole day, Bryn said, her voice cracking slightly. And I didn't want to start a fight with her a week before my own baby shower. I thought I could smooth it over somehow without actually having to pick a side. Colleen let the silence sit for a moment before she answered, because she had learned, over the years, that some silences did more work than words could. I'm not angry that the furniture arrived when it did, she said finally. I'm sad that I had to find out I wasn't welcome from a text message 2 hours before I was supposed to walk in the door. That's the part I need you to sit with, not the driveway. The conversation that mattered most happened 3 days later, not between Colleen and Bryn, but between Colleen and Sheila, In a call, Sheila initiated herself, which surprised Colleen more than almost anything else that had happened that week. Sheila's opening move was an attempt at an apology that wasn't quite an apology. A long explanation about how overwhelming the planning had become, how she hadn't meant for anyone to feel excluded, how the guest list decisions had simply gotten away from her, given how many people wanted to celebrate Bryn and Dean. Colleen let her finish before responding. "I appreciate you calling," she said, "but I think we both know the guest list wasn't the real issue. I was uninvited from my daughter's baby shower 2 hours before it started, after months of being slowly moved out of every decision related to it. That's not overwhelm, that's a pattern." Sheila's tone shifted, the warmth in it cooling into something more clipped. "I don't think that's fair. I hosted the entire event. I paid for the venue, the catering, the decorations. I think I'm allowed some say in how it runs." "You are," Colleen said, "and I never asked to run it. I asked to be included in it, as Bryn's mother, in a day that was supposed to celebrate her and her baby, not whichever version of the day made you feel most comfortable as the host." There was a silence on the line that stretched longer than any of the others in that difficult week, and when Sheila spoke again, her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I didn't think about it that way." "I believe you," Colleen said, and she meant it, mostly, though she also understood, in the way people sometimes understand things about themselves and others at the exact same moment, that not thinking about it that way had been its own kind of choice, made easier by the fact that Sheila had never once had to sit on the outside of a decision that concerned someone she loved. Sheila tried, near the end of the call, to explain the guest list decision from her own perspective, describing the anxiety of hosting a large event in her own home, the desire to control a room full of unfamiliar faces, the genuine, if misguided, belief that keeping the numbers smaller and more familiar to her would make the day run more smoothly for everyone involved, Colleen included. "I understand wanting the day to run smoothly," Colleen said, "but smooth for you and smooth for me turned out to mean very different things. Smooth for you meant a room full of people you already knew how to manage. Smooth for me would have meant being in the room at all." Sheila didn't have a ready answer for that, and the silence that followed felt different from the earlier ones, less defensive, closer to something Colleen might have called genuine consideration, though she withheld judgment on how long that consideration would actually last once the conversation ended and ordinary life resumed around both of them. They didn't resolve everything on that call. Colleen didn't expect them to. But something in the dynamic had shifted, quietly, in the way these things sometimes do, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through the simple, undeniable fact of a delivery truck arriving on schedule, doing exactly what it had been paid to do, and refusing, in its own mundane way, to be edited out of the story. The nursery furniture stayed in the garage for 2 weeks before Bryn and Dean moved it into the actual nursery themselves, quietly, without asking Sheila's opinion on the arrangement. Bryn sent Colleen a photo of the finished room a few days later, the sage green crib set up beneath the window exactly the way it had looked in the pictures Colleen had saved months earlier, along with a single line of text. "It's perfect, Mom. Thank you for not giving up on it even after everything." Colleen looked at the photo for a long time before she answered. She thought about the drive to the coffee shop, the cold cup of coffee, the text from Denise about the truck in the driveway, and the strange, unplanned way the whole situation had ended up revealing something that months of careful conversation hadn't quite managed to surface on its own. She was invited to the actual birth, 6 weeks later, present in the hospital room within the first hour, holding her granddaughter in a chair by the window while Bryn slept and Dean made phone calls in the hallway. Sheila arrived later that same afternoon, and the two women exchanged a brief, careful greeting that wasn't warm exactly, but wasn't cold either, the beginning of some new, more honest arrangement neither of them had fully worked out yet. The christening took place 4 months after that, in the same church where Bryn had been baptized as an infant, and this time the planning happened differently, with Bryn making a point of copying Colleen into every email thread, every decision, every small logistical question about timing and seating that came up in the weeks beforehand. Sheila hosted the reception afterward at her home, the same driveway where the delivery truck had once caused such a stir. And this time Colleen stood in the center of the gathering rather than its edges, holding her granddaughter while a photographer Sheila had hired took a photo that ended up, months later, in a frame on Colleen's own mantle, the two grandmothers standing on either side of Bryn with a baby between them, none of the old tension visible in the picture at all, though Colleen knew, looking at it, exactly how much quiet work had gone into making the photo possible. She didn't think the tension had disappeared entirely. Sheila was still Sheila, still inclined toward taking up more space in a room than anyone had necessarily offered her, still capable of the kind of comment that required a beat of translation before you understood what it had actually meant. But something had shifted after that shower, something neither woman had ever directly named out loud, a quiet recalibration of who got to be included and how. And Colleen suspected that recalibration had less to do with anything she or Sheila had said to each other on that difficult phone call, and more to do with the simple, undeniable fact of a truck arriving on schedule in front of 30 witnesses, doing exactly what it had been paid to do. Colleen thinks about that shower sometimes, the 2 hours she spent in the coffee shop instead of at the party she had planned for, and the strange fact that the moment which finally made her daughter understand what had been happening wasn't a conversation, wasn't an argument, wasn't even something Colleen orchestrated at all. It was just a truck, arriving exactly on time, carrying furniture that had her name on it, because she was the one who had actually shown up, months in advance, in the only way circumstances had left available to her that day. If you've ever been quietly pushed to the edges of a moment that was supposed to be yours to share, not through anything loud or dramatic, but through 100 small decisions made without you, what finally made you notice the pattern for what it was? And if you were the one making those decisions, even with good intentions, would a truck showing up unannounced have been enough to make you see it too?